I-Town. Written by Timothy Koch. Narrated by Daniel Burns. For Sonia. Always. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other. From the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Chapter 1. Jackson led his little sister through the stone pillars below I-Town. Mr. Myrtle waded deep within its cellars. The strange little man wore shiny scarlet pants and a jacket of vermilion silk. The two colors were nearly the same, but different enough to make the unease in Jackson's stomach worse. The jacket draped over the man's narrow shoulders. He held his hands behind his back, allowing his jacket to hang open and expose a little paunch of a belly. Ava held Jackson's hand and trotted along beside him. She held her heavy doll in her other hand and looked into its elegantly sculpted face. Above them, a lattice of timber trusses supported Wheel 3, one of I-Town's 9 induction generator tread wheels. 500 feet in diameter, half that in breadth. 100 tons. In a sporting arena, the tread wheel would cover the field, end zones, sidelines, and the seats around them. The weight of thousands of people walking inside drove it. Copper coils overlaid its outer surface, revolving within an electromagnetic sheath, inducing voltage into the Trintico power grid. Mr. Myrtle leaned against the base of one of the massive stone piers. Behind him, farther into the darkness, sat a wooden crate. His attention snapped away from Jackson and onto Ava. Jackson tightened his grip on her hand, regretting coming here, regretting even more that had brought her with him. Ava pulled free from his protective grip. She turned a reprimanding glance up at him. She was 6, the look said, and would not be babied. She faced heavy up at him as well. The strong features of a broad-bodied, ironclad woman offered a reprimand of its own. How could you bring her here? But he had no choice. Dad went from unloading the walkers' food from the supply train to washing their diapers at the laundry, and their mother was out of their lives now, or at least they were out of hers. Mr. Myrtle leaned forward to get closer to Ava. One hand remained hidden, holding something behind his back. He scraped and tapped the stones with it. Tipping his tall, shiny purple hat, he said, "That's a beautiful doll. Is that a real, heavy doll?" Ava returned a proud, vigorous nod. "Wow," the man breathed, glancing up at Jackson with suspicion in his green eyes. "And aren't you a beautiful girl, too?" Ava giggled and said, "Yes." Mr. Myrtle laughed. Strands of black hair wafted over his shoulders. His eyes drifted up and down Ava's plump body. "Are you going to grow up to be a big, ironclad walker like Heavy?" Again, Ava nodded. It was true. She was the fortunate child, having come out of the gene pool at their mother's end, with a healthy, hefty body. Jackson, on the other hand, was cursed with their dad's thinness, barely weighing 100 pounds. "Good girl," Mr. Myrtle said, his gaze all over her. Jackson cleared his throat. "What can I do for you?" Mr. Myrtle pulled his attention from Ava and gave Jackson a look of disdain. He tipped his head toward the darker recesses of the cellars, and then upward, and said, "Hook that to something up there." Jackson followed the first gesture and found an electric panel on a frame of scrap lumber. A big service wire draped from it and coiled on the dirty floor like the tail of a monkey. All was salvaged from abandoned carbonation buildings out in the wilds. "Excuse me?" Jackson said, certain that he'd misunderstood. Mr. Myrtle stared, annoyed. Jackson said, "You're not suggesting I vamp an unmetered connection?" Mr. Myrtle gasped and glanced down at Ava as if her opinion of him might have been compromised by Jackson's accusation. He whispered, "Well, that would be a felony, now wouldn't it?" "Yes," Jackson said. "And you said some light utility work, that's not..." Jackson hushed when Mr. Myrtle's concealed hand came out from behind his back, clutching the handle of a sleek black walking cane. "You want the books?" Mr. Myrtle said, pointing the knobby fingers of his other hand behind him at the box. "Ooh," Ava squealed. "Is that the books?" Jackson's breath caught in his throat as she skipped past the man, brushing the cane, bumping heavy against it, sending chainmail rattling and flipping one of the doll's jointed legs back to mimic Ava's own posture. "Why, yes, it is," Mr. Myrtle said, "and just as soon as your brother gets his work done, you'll have them all in a 4-foot square on the weigh-in platform upstairs." "4?" Jackson began. "You said—" Mr. Myrtle raised the cane until the round rubber handle sat between their faces. "Recognize it?" he asked. Jackson resisted the urge to look away or even blink, doing his best to defy the man. "A gentleman's walking stick," the man said. "But not merely a walking stick." He brought his bony fingers up to the handle and pulled off the round rubber ball to expose 2 metal prongs. Mr. Myrtle gasped. "What have we here? A knocker rod? So named for the sound they make?" He shook the device. Inside the long shaft, magnets slid up and down inside tightly wound coils of wire. The action charged a fat capacitor just below the 2 protruding electrodes. "Quiet," Mr. Myrtle said, tipping his ear toward the rod, making a show of listening to the sound. "What do you think? Little springs muffling the sound?" Jackson knew exactly what quieted the clack of the magnets. Not springs. None had been available. A little bit of fabric instead. Mr. Myrtle lowered his voice, glancing quickly around at Ava. "Or is it called a knocker rod because of the way it can knock a guy on his ass?" He flicked the exposed prongs at Jackson's face and giggled when Jackson flinched. "Now, there's nothing wrong with having a knocker rod," Mr. Myrtle continued. "Perfectly legal. The only weapon allowed by the bylaws of the Trentigo Corporate Society in compliance with the Global Power Authority's ban on all forms of energy storage, including explosives." "Capacitors are energy storage devices," Jackson said. "Oh, aren't you the smart one?" Mr. Myrtle said. "Smarter than Secretary Faraday and President Burgess, who saved us all when they designed this great society. I suppose that's why you're here, because you're so smart. Above the law." "You're the one with the concealed knocker rod," Jackson said. "Indeed. An unregistered weapon is a crime worthy of a $100 fine. A year's income even to those people up there." Mr. Myrtle pointed to the revolving wheel above them. He shrugged. "To possess a concealed weapon would get me a stint on the jail wheel. But to construct and then sell such an illegal device?" He drew in a deep breath and narrowed his green eyes. "That could be life. Or death. That person would be lucky to spend the rest of his life walking in jail. More likely, they'd farm him out. Send him to the farmlands where they work you to death, or they eat you." Jackson could have gone on to argue the point that growing food to feed the walkers so they could turn a treadwheel to make electricity was no different than cutting down a tree and burning it to make steam to turn a turbine. But there was no point going on any longer, not with this man, not here in the cellars beneath Wheel 3, and not in the presence of the illegal device. Jackson built it and sold it to pay the deposit and first week's rent on the apartment he and his father and sister lived in now. It got them out of Shacktown, out of the weather, safe inside the guts of Wheel 3. Beyond the dangerous little man, Ava raised the lid on the crate and peered inside. She called out, "Jackson, can we read one?" "In a minute, Ava," he replied. "Let me get this job done." Mr. Myrtle nodded. His grin went all toothy. Jackson ruefully thought of Sir Isaac Newton's first law of motion. A body at rest tends to stay at rest. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. A body earning an honest living would likely go on doing so, and a body committing crime would probably have to do it again. But this time was the last, he promised himself, as he looked up at the enormous treadwheel. If he came down alive and managed to rent even a few books to the walkers at the back of the wheel, who risked losing their place as the weight requirements increased, he would shake off his yoke of crime and walk the straight and narrow the remainder of his days. He turned to the awaiting electric panel and coil of wire, but then paused. "Listen, our dad..." "Levine Koss," Mr. Myrtle said. "I know. He's at the laundry right now. You'll do fine. What are you, 13, 14 years old?" "16, sir." "Older than I thought. Well into manhood. And I'd trust you, or I wouldn't have hired you." Jackson nodded reluctantly and turned to a pile of scrap at the base of one of the fat concrete columns. As he picked through the debris, he kept an eye on Ava. Their host had joined her at the crate, and she immediately set into telling how their mother had gotten sick and they needed to leave her alone until she could get better. This was a myth to comfort a child. Hearing her repeat the lie made him regret fabricating it, and seeing the small man stare hungrily down at Ava and Heavy spurred Jackson to get the job done and get them out of here. It didn't take him long digging through the salvage from old carbonation buildings to find the components of a hot stick, a tool to hopefully help him make the connection without getting fried. A long piece of pipe with a jagged broken end would do for the handle, and a length of flexible cord would secure the service wire to it. Ava stood by the crate, swinging the expensive doll around, the solitary symbol of the well-to-do family they had once been part of. Jackson gave her a quick wave. On the one hand, he wished Mr. Myrtle would take her away in case something went wrong, so she wouldn't hear and then smell her brother's body as it took amperage. On the other hand, the way Mr. Myrtle gawked at her, almost drooling over the admirable bulk of her promisingly substantial young body, made Jackson want to keep her close. Ava flung Heavy into the air, returning his wave without breaking stride in her conversation. She was fine without him. Maybe she would be better off without him. Maybe it had been his growing so tall and thin that had cursed them with the expulsion from their mother's family. The Piedmonts had the stout build necessary to turn the big tread wheels of I-Town. Maybe if he didn't come down alive, they would take her back. He was being dramatic again. Had read too many stories, Uncle Blaine would say. Ava would be fine, and so would he. He just had to focus and get the job over with, get on with their new life. Jackson took the free end of the service wire and ascended a ladder of bars sticking from the mortar joints of one of the piers. The bowels of I-Town hung like a girth beneath the belly of Wheel 3, a lattice of pipework and conduits. He gathered the full length of the ropey service wire up to the lowest beam. This close to the wheel, he felt like a bug sitting on Atlas's shoulder, the weight of the world pressing down on him. The high-voltage bus ribs of the wheel were just above his head, too close, each one carrying enough electricity to kill. He could smell the metallic aggravation of ionized air around the excited coils. Suddenly doubting the potential of his plan, he paused and considered going back. What if he did all this and nobody wanted the books? It seemed perfectly logical to him that walkers would enjoy reading while they trod up the curving inner tread of the wheel. He'd been wrong before, though, thinking Uncle Blaine liked him. But he was damned either way. Mr. Myrtle would turn him in for the walking stick if he didn't vamp the connection. Mr. Myrtle's voice drifted up. "How's it going, boy?" Jackson crawled across a stone arch that spanned between piers like the boughs of great trees, and gave a thumbs up through the gap in the structure. He was 30 feet up now, and just at the first stage of his climb. No turning back. He would get the books and make the plan work or die trying. He sidled up a timber truss supporting axles of old rail cars, wheels rolling opposite the constant revolution of the treadwheel. Wheels 3 and 5 were two of the biggest of I-Town's 9 wheels, because they had aft feeds above the cellars to send power to Agrariana on the plateau to the south. Jackson moved toward the aft side of the wheel, away from the walk zone. Each time Jackson passed an opening in the lattice of timbers, he checked on Ava, and each time she was talking contentedly to their host, and he was gawking attentively and hungrily down at her, absorbing her. At the next stone arch, a massive pipe, probably sewer, tried to bar his way, but Jackson pulled his thin body through the gap between pipe and stone. Gathering the service wire to his new purchase, he realized that he had arrived. It was a bittersweet situation. The climb was over, but a garden of deadly bare connections surrounded him. Bus bars, transfer brushes, lugs on transformers. Gray metal appeared cool and benign, but oh, the power hidden within. Big wires plunged from transformers to the loading docks below, where they serviced the rail line that brought food down from Agrariana. Scant morning twilight marked the rails and the power lines along their curving ascent until they disappeared into the dark sky of the western horizon. Tempering himself for the task at hand, telling himself again that it would be worth it, he took a deep breath and wiped sweat from his palms onto the legs of his baggy chinos. Moisture was a conductor, and he didn't want to aid conductance where he stood. The electric charge in the components around him was a bulging bicep ready to strike out. The earth below and the mass of the stone structure were a punching bag, ready to take that charge with ignorant bliss. All they needed was a connection point, and he didn't want to be the place where the fist hit the bag. He inventoried the bare metal conductors. All were spaced well apart to prevent arcing. He needed to maintain that distance. Below, Ava had arranged a pair of books into a sofa for Heavy. The doll sat contentedly and stared at the girl who went on chatting with Mr. Myrtle while he watched her with lustful delight. An obvious ironclad child. Did their mother wonder right now where they were? If she saw them now, or if she had seen them scavenging in the huts and tents and grave markers of Shacktown, would she stand up to her brother and insist he let her husband and children back into the family? Or would she at least join them, putting her weight to work on a wheel to help support them? Jackson snorted the distraction away. It didn't matter. They were here now, and he was 2 steps away from finishing. He spied a pair of fuses. Big things. Tubes several inches long and held in place by stout metal jaws at each end. That would do it. He untwined and spread apart the 2 conductors of the service wire, making a Y as long as the plastic pipe handle of his hot stick, then twisted a hook into the end of each branch. With a quick slip knot, he cinched one of the branches of the service wire to the broken end of the plastic pipe. He gritted his teeth and walked his hand along the pipe handle of the hot stick, booming it out toward the fuse connection, feeling sweat on his hands again, trickling down his arms. Maybe his idea would work, and he'd make a good living, at least for a small person, renting books to walkers. Maybe he'd show Uncle Blaine and Grandma Piedmont that he and Dad and Ava didn't need their wealth to survive. The hot stick bent under the weight of the heavy-gauge wire. Jackson grabbed up the wire and held it high, using it to lift and straighten the pipe, each supporting the other. The free end quaked as he guided the trussed couple of pipe and wire toward the target. The fuse connector seemed smaller now that the end of the fat wire was near it. The fit was going to be tight, which was good and bad. It would ensure the connection held if Jackson could manage to make it. He could do it. He had to. Hate swelled in him, for the people inside the wheel who were big enough to walk for a living, for round-bellied Mr. Myrtle with his wrong red suit and his ridiculous purple hat and his long stringy hair and the way he salivated when he looked at Ava's healthy build and expensive heavy doll. Jackson stabbed the wire into the connector and held his breath. Mr. Myrtle's voice pierced the moment and seared Jackson's mind. "You about done up there, boy?" Jackson didn't answer. He tugged the cord that tied the stubborn service wire to the pipe. The end of the pipe fell away, and the wire held its place in the fuse connector. Jackson sucked in a huge breath. He leaned back until he could see the curious face of his host, gave a quick nod, and then scooped up the other branch of the service wire. Just this. Just one more thing. Then he would be free to launch his new life. He swiped sweat from his forehead with the baggy sleeve of his shirt and tied the free end of the service wire to his hot stick. One down, one to go. If he'd managed the first, then why not the second, too? He had this in the bag, he hoped. He boomed the pipe out again. Palms sweating, thin arms shaking, a tremor moved down his body, not born of anxiety or exertion, but of pure fear. Chevy's rotor wasn't where she had left it the night before. It was her engagement token, the disc part of the brakes of an old Carbon Nation car, the symbol of the Turney family she would marry into. Because of her name, her fiancé had special ordered a brake rotor from a Chevrolet Chevelle from the scavengers who pilfered the scrap heaps of the wilds. "Just the sweetest thing," her friend Tasha had said the first time she wore it onto the treadwheel, while her other friend Stacy had been too envious to say a word. Chevy had proudly worn the 22-pound hat-shaped steel disc on a chain around her neck for several months, before the minimum weight limit had gone up. Since then, she'd worn it out of pure necessity. It and Dad's two 10-pound struts just got her from 160 up to the 200 pounds she needed to get on the last row of wheel 3. The load warning horn made its buzzing blat in the hall outside the apartment. Demand was up earlier every day. The weight standards would be going up again soon. Maybe they already had overnight, and Chevy wouldn't know about it till she got down to weigh-in and found herself out of a job. "Perry, have you seen my rotor?" she shouted. Perry strutted out of his bedroom. His perpetual smirk bunched his fat cheeks. "Last time I saw it, Mom was wearing it." Chevy groaned. "I hate the night shift." Perry giggled maliciously and pulled their dad's chain vest onto his shoulders. "Can I borrow some?" she asked. Perry outweighed his big sister by 30 pounds. He was one of the biggest 14-year-olds on wheel 3. His vest was made of a set of tire chains. Weighing 40 pounds all by itself, it was more than enough to get him on the wheel. Then he had another 20 pounds of accessorizing bolts and parts hooked through and dangling from the crisscross of chains. It wasn't a set of Stendhal custom armor, but they weren't high class like the Turneys. The Lilborns were somewhere at the lower end of the middle class, since the random killer thrombosis had taken her dad. Perry laughed again, this time disgusted, or disbelieving, or both, and shook his head. "Come on," Chevy coaxed. She knew she wouldn't get anywhere with the punk until she came right out and begged. "You can get on the wheel easy." "Nope." "You take the struts. That'll be enough for you."
"I'm not walking back there with you. Wait for Mom."
"I could miss a spot altogether if she's too late." "Too bad." "I'll tell Cole." Cole Turney was her fiancé, and Perry followed him around like a second shadow. "Tell him what? That your mommy wears his engagement rotor to walk the night shift?" Chevy froze. Her jaw tightened. Perry swaggered past her. "Sorry, sis, but Kyle's bringing his new scepter today. It's a gear-ended axle, and I want to see it." "So you can see it doesn't mean you have to walk beside him." "We're the Titanics," Perry said with sarcastic slowness. Then his tone went teasingly apologetic. "We walk together." "You're selfish, that's what you are. Dad would want both of us walking." "Maybe, but he also might want me walking with my gang." "You didn't know him very well if that's what you really think." He leaned back and gave her a long up and down look. "How low are you willing to go with this?" "If I can't walk," Chevy began, but that was as far as she could get. She shouldn't have brought Dad into it. "Rent something from one of those crazy dims that beg on the weigh-in platform." "If we could afford that, Mom would have done it." "Maybe the both of you ought to eat a little more. Maybe that's really what Dad would say." "You're an ass." "Yep, a big one. Big belly, too." His shirt stretched over the rolls of fat around his middle. He grabbed them and shook them proudly. The apartment door opened before him. Their mother's tall frame filled the opening, and for the first time, Chevy realized that she was getting thin. Too thin. Her face was long and gaunt and covered with worry. "Better get up there," Mom said. "Weird heavy demand this morning, like something's shorted out." "Cool," Perry said, and pulled his lunch pack onto his back. "Maybe a vampir's getting fried somewhere." Then Chevy noticed what was missing about Mom's wardrobe. The shoulder straps and girth of the saddle Dad had carried her and then Perry in were there, crossing the thin and delicate scale mail Mom had worn when she and Dad had been married. Her dashboard was there across the front of her waist, with a big cup in its cup holder. But not the brake rotor. nor the heavy chain that passed through the big center hole of the rotor. Neither was around Mom's neck. "What happened?" Chevy asked as Mom stepped inside. "Roll on," Perry sang as he charged through the open doorway. "Perry!" Chevy barked. She knew Mom would make him share with her, and she knew he knew it too. The sound of chains rattling down the long hall faded as he made his escape. "I bet it," Mom said. "What?" Chevy would not accept it. The first thing she'd been afraid of when she saw the rotor was gone. The one thing she knew had happened, and at the same time never knew would or could, had actually happened. The cost of having a parent who played the gambling tables. Oh, Chevy hated the night shift. "You lost it?" "I'll win it back." "No!" The implications piled up in Chevy's mind like ironclads pressing through a peak demand surge. She wouldn't get out on the wheel. She'd miss a whole day's wages. Cole would find out. Mr. and Mrs. Turney would find out. He would shrug and shake his head, but she, Mrs. Turney, had a way of putting her hands on her hips and glaring at you that was more forceful than the entire family of 9, 28 counting in-laws and grandkids, piling on you. "We'll pool our money. Perry too. I'll get it back." She shrugged like this wasn't the stupidest thing anyone had ever done. "How could you?" Chevy asked. "I'm getting us out of the gut," Mom replied matter-of-factly. "By throwing my stuff away?" "I didn't throw it away," Mom corrected. Chevy snarled and pushed past her, pulling the straps of her lunch pack onto her shoulders. "Get back on days and put on some weight," she said, just wanting to hurt her. "That's what Dad would want," she jibed as she charged out the door, slamming it behind her. Down the long hall of the gut, the yellow light in the middle of the red, yellow, and green demand indicator flashed, and the load warning horn sounded again. Chevy cursed Perry, him and his selfishness. She suddenly sensed Mom coming to the door, either hearing her footsteps or just tapping that mother-daughter link they sometimes shared. Chevy ran down the hall to the stairs. She'd had the last word and wanted to keep it as long as she could, but she didn't. The door opened, and her mother called out behind her, Chevy, don't be stupid. Take the saddle." Chevy stopped, stared at the floor for a second, humiliated. "It won't be enough." "Maybe not by itself," Mom said sensibly, holding out the leather seat and straps. "But it won't hurt to take it." It would hurt plenty, but Chevy grabbed it and turned away. Her earliest and best memories were of riding on Dad's back as he walked way up in the front lines. Mom tried to get him to sell it when Perry grew too big and went off to school, but he refused. She tried again when they moved up to the terraces, but he insisted that Chevy would carry his first grandbaby in that saddle. And then he was gone. Now that they were back in the gut, Mom wore the saddle every night. Chevy wrestled her pack off her shoulders and put it back on over the saddle. Maybe, if she took some extra lunch, she'd have enough weight to get on the wheel.